The city square hummed with the kind of noise that only comes at the end of a long day. Tired footsteps, the clatter of closing shop signs, the distant honk of a bus squeezing through traffic. Autumn had settled in properly now, painting the trees in fiery reds and golds, but the air carried a sharpness that made people pull their coats tighter and hurry home. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows over cobblestones worn smooth by generations of feet. Tucked between a second-hand bookstore with fogged-up windows and a flower stall still selling the last of its chrysanthemums, a small cafe glowed warmly against the cooling evening. Its outdoor patio was modest, just a few wrought-iron tables, mismatched chairs, and, unusually for a place this size, an old upright piano tucked into the far corner. It wasn't grand or polished. The wood was scratched, the ivory keys yellowed with age, and one of its legs had been propped up with a folded napkin to keep it from wobbling. But every evening, without fail, someone played it, usually soft jazz, sometimes a Chopin piece, occasionally a simple folk tune. The music wasn't loud, but it drifted out into the square like a quiet promise. You're welcome here. That night, however, the piano sat empty. The regular player, a retired schoolteacher who came by after dinner, had called in sick with a bad cold. The cafe owner, a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper stubble and eyes that had seen too many winters, had sighed, plugged his phone into a small speaker, and let a generic cafe classics playlist fill the space. It was fine, he told himself. People weren't here for the music anyway. They were here for coffee, for a quick bite, for a place to rest before heading home. But then, just as he was wiping down the counter for the third time that hour, a small figure appeared at the edge of the patio. She was barely taller than the cafe's potted ivy. Her coat was 2 sizes too big, the sleeves swallowing her hands, and her shoes, once black, now gray with grime, had holes near the toes. Her hair, dark and tangled, hung in loose strands around a face that looked both young and ancient at the same time. There was a quietness about her, a stillness that made her seem almost invisible against the moving backdrop of the city. But her eyes, those were sharp. They scanned the patio, the tables, the piano, the people, taking everything in with a kind of cautious hope. She stood there for nearly a full minute, unnoticed by most. A couple laughed over their lattes. A man scrolled through his phone. A street performer packed up his guitar a few yards away. No one looked at her. No one ever did. Finally, she took a breath, deep, shaky, and stepped forward. Her feet made no sound on the stone. She stopped just short of the counter, hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. "Excuse me," she said, voice so soft it nearly vanished in the air. The cafe owner looked up. He'd been lost in thought, wondering if he should close early. But something in her tone, fragile but not begging, made him pause. "Yeah?" he said, setting down his rag. She swallowed. Her gaze flicked to the piano, then back to him. Can I play for a piece of food?" For a beat he just stared. Then from a nearby table a man snorted. "Oh, here we go," he muttered to his friend. "Next she'll be juggling spoons." A few others chuckled. Not meanly, just the kind of automatic reaction people have when something unexpected happens in their routine. The girl didn't flinch. She just stood there, waiting. The owner studied her. He'd seen street kids before. Some were bold, demanding coins or snacks. Others stayed in the shadows, too proud or too scared to ask. This one was different. There was no desperation in her posture, no theatrics. Just a simple question, offered like a trade. He glanced at the piano, then at the half-empty cafe, then back at her. "All right," he said, shrugging. "Go ahead. If you can play better than my playlist, you get a sandwich. And maybe some soup." A few people laughed again, light, amused. One woman smiled kindly but shook her head as if to say, "Bless her heart, but she's got no idea what she's up against." The girl didn't react. She just nodded once, turned, and walked slowly toward the piano. Her steps were careful, deliberate, like she was approaching something sacred. She sat on the bench. It groaned under her slight weight. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, testing them. One key stuck slightly, E-flat maybe, but she didn't seem to mind. She closed her eyes for just a second, as if gathering herself, and then began to play. The first notes were so soft they could have been mistaken for the wind. But then the melody rose, clear, haunting, achingly beautiful. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, though no one there would have known the name. All they knew was that the air had changed, the chatter died, the clinking of spoons stopped. Even the street noise beyond the patio, the honking, the footsteps, the distant siren seemed to fade into the background, as if the city itself had decided to listen. Her fingers moved with a grace that defied her age. Not flashy, not showy, just pure, honest music. Every note carried weight. Every pause spoke as loudly as the sound. There was sorrow in it, yes, the kind that comes from loneliness, from loss, but also resilience. A quiet strength that made more than one person sit up straighter, eyes suddenly bright. At a corner table, an elderly woman froze mid-sip. Her teacup hovered halfway to her lips. She'd spent 40 years teaching piano at a conservatory before retiring to this city to be near her grandchildren. She knew technique. She knew emotion. And what she was hearing now, this wasn't just skill. This was soul. The girl played as if the piano had been waiting for her all along, as if the music had lived inside her, silent and patient until this very moment. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she wasn't hungry, wasn't cold, wasn't alone. She was home. When the final chord faded into the evening air, silence hung thick and heavy. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the cafe owner stood frozen behind the counter, a wrapped sandwich forgotten in his hand. Then, slowly, the elderly woman began to clap. It was just one pair of hands at first. Soft, steady. But then another joined. And another. Within seconds, the whole patio was applauding, not out of pity, but out of awe. The man who'd snorted earlier wiped his eyes quickly, pretending to adjust his glasses. The owner walked over, his boots clicking softly on the stone. He placed the sandwich on the bench beside her, then added a bowl of steaming vegetable soup and a clean napkin. That was incredible, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Who taught you to play like that? The girl looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, tired, but clear, like a lake after rain. She shook her head slightly. No one, she said softly. Listen, he didn't know what to say to that. So he nodded, cleared his throat, and said, Eat. Take your time. She picked up the sandwich with careful hands, as if it might vanish if she held it too tightly. She took a small bite, chewed slowly, and for the first time that evening, a tiny, fragile smile touched her lips. Around her, the cafe slowly came back to life, but differently now. Conversations resumed, but in lower voices. People glanced at her not with suspicion, but with something like wonder. The elderly woman stood, walked over, and placed a $5 bill gently on the piano lid. For your next meal, she said, her voice warm. The girl looked at the money, then at the woman, and whispered, Thank you. Outside, the city kept moving. Buses rumbled past. Streetlights glowed. But inside that little cafe, something had shifted. It wasn't just about a free sandwich anymore. It was about seeing someone who'd been invisible, and realizing they'd been carrying light all along. No one knew her story yet. They didn't know about the nights she'd spent under bridges, the days she'd gone without food, the way she'd taught herself piano by pressing her ear against the windows of music schools, memorizing every note, every rhythm, every feeling. They didn't know that her father used to hum classical pieces while fixing things around their tiny apartment, or that after he and her mother were gone, music became the only thing that kept her from disappearing completely. But they didn't need to know all that to feel it. You could hear it in the way her fingers touched the keys, in the spaces between the notes, in the quiet courage of her request. Can I play for a piece of food? It wasn't a plea. It was an offering, and the world for once had said yes. As she ate, the cafe owner quietly turned off the playlist. The piano stayed silent now, but its presence felt different, alive somehow. He made a mental note to keep it tuned, to leave it out every night just in case, because you never know when genius will walk in, cold and quiet, asking only for a chance, and you never know how one small yes might change everything. The applause didn't last long, just a few seconds, but it left a warmth in the air that lingered. Long after the clapping stopped, people exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling like they just witnessed something rare and precious. The girl sat quietly on the piano bench, still holding her sandwich, taking small, careful bites as if she were afraid it might vanish if she ate too fast. Steam rose from the bowl of soup beside her, curling into the cool evening like a promise of comfort. The cafe owner stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her. He wasn't sure what to do next. Part of him wanted to ask a dozen questions. Who she was, where she'd learned to play like that, whether she had a place to sleep tonight. But another part of him held back. There was something fragile about her, like a bird that had just landed on a windowsill after a long storm. Too much noise, too much attention, and she might fly away. Instead, he turned and went back inside, returning a minute later with a thick wool blanket he kept behind the counter for late-night staff. He draped it gently over her shoulders without a word. She looked up, surprised, then gave him the tiniest nod of thanks. At the corner table, the elderly woman hadn't moved. She watched the girl with eyes that held decades of music, of teaching, of listening to thousands of students fumble through scales and arpeggios. But this was different. This wasn't practiced perfection. This was truth, raw, unfiltered, and real. She'd heard prodigies before, kids with perfect pitch, lightning fingers, flawless technique. But none of them had ever made her feel the way this child just had. It wasn't about the notes. It was about what lived between them. She finished her tea slowly, then stood, smoothing her coat. She walked over, not with urgency, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. "May I sit?" she asked softly, gesturing to the bench. The girl hesitated, then scooted over slightly. The woman sat, careful not to crowd her. "You play with your whole heart," she said, voice low and warm. "Not just your hands." The girl looked down at her lap. "I don't know how else to do it." "You don't need to," the woman replied. "Most people spend their whole lives trying to learn what you already know." A silence settled between them, comfortable this time. Not awkward, not heavy, just quiet, like the space after a beautiful piece of music ends. Inside the cafe, the playlist stayed off. The owner had unplugged the speaker entirely. He leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching the two of them. Something about the scene felt sacred, like he was witnessing a moment he wasn't meant to interrupt. Then from the street, a voice called out, sharp, impatient. "Hey, you done yet? We gotta go." It was a man in a delivery uniform standing by a parked scooter, checking his watch. He wasn't yelling at the girl, but the sudden noise made her flinch. Her shoulders tensed. She glanced toward the street, then quickly back at her food, eating faster now, as if afraid she'd be pulled away before she finished. The elderly woman noticed. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" she asked gently. The girl didn't answer right away. She set down her sandwich, wiped her mouth with the napkin, and looked out toward the square. The lights were brighter now, the crowds thinner. The night was deepening, and with it the cold. "I'll find somewhere," she said quietly. That was all. No details. No complaints. Just acceptance, worn smooth by repetition. The woman studied her for a long moment. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook and a pen. She wrote something down, tore out the page, and handed it to the girl. "My address," she said, "and my phone number. If you ever need a warm place to stay, or if you just want to play piano somewhere safe, you can come, anytime." The girl stared at the paper like it was made of gold. She didn't take it right away. "Why?" she finally asked, voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled. "Because music like yours shouldn't be lost in the streets, and because no child should have to ask for food in exchange for beauty." Tears welled in the girl's eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of her oversized coat, right over her heart. "Thank you," she said. Just then, the cafe owner approached with a to-go container. "Leftover soup," he said, placing it in her hands, "and a couple of rolls. For tomorrow." She looked from him to the elderly woman, then down at the food, then back at the piano. For a second, it seemed like she might say something more, might ask if she could play again or if they'd let her come back. But she didn't. Instead, she stood, wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and gave them both a small, solemn bow like a performer thanking an audience. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the flow of the evening crowd as quietly as she'd arrived. But she didn't get far. A young man at a nearby table had been filming the whole thing on his phone. Not in a creepy way, but like someone who'd just seen lightning strike and wanted to remember it. He hadn't posted it yet. He just watched her go, then looked at the video on his screen. Without thinking, he uploaded it to a local community page with a simple caption. "This kid played Chopin for a sandwich tonight. You won't believe your ears." By midnight, the video had been shared over 5,000 times. By morning, it had hit 100,000. People were stunned. Comments poured in. Is this real? Who is she? This brought me to tears. Find her. Help her. Local news stations picked it up. A radio host played the audio during the morning commute. Someone recognized the cafe and posted its location. By lunchtime, reporters were showing up, microphones in hand, asking if anyone knew where the girl had gone. The cafe owner refused to give interviews. She's just a kid, he told them firmly. Leave her alone. But the story kept growing. Meanwhile, the elderly woman sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea, watching the news on her small television. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Friends, former students, even a few journalists. But she ignored them all. She kept thinking about the way the girl's fingers had moved, like they remembered something her mind hadn't yet learned, like the music was already inside her, waiting for hands to set it free. She also kept thinking about that look in the girl's eyes, the one that said she'd been alone for a very long time. 2 days passed. The buzz in the city grew louder. Flyers went up near shelters and community centers. If you've seen this young pianist, please contact. But no one came forward. It was as if she'd vanished. Then on the third evening, just as the sun was setting and the streetlights flickered on, a small figure appeared again at the edge of the cafe patio. It was her. She looked the same coat, same quiet step, but she carried herself differently now. Less like she was bracing for rejection, more like she was testing the waters of hope. The cafe owner saw her first. He was sweeping the patio when he looked up and froze. Without a word, he went inside and came back with a fresh sandwich, a bowl of soup, and the same wool blanket. She didn't ask to play this time. She just stood there holding the folded paper the elderly woman had given her. I went to the address, she said softly. But I didn't knock. Why not? He asked, handing her the food. She looked down. I was scared you'd say no. He didn't know what to say to that. So he just nodded and said, Eat. You're safe here. She sat on the bench and began to eat. After a few minutes, the elderly woman appeared at the edge of the patio, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. She didn't rush. She just walked over, sat beside the girl, and said, I'm glad you came back. The girl swallowed. I didn't know where else to go. You don't have to know, the woman said. Not anymore. That night, they didn't talk about music. They talked about simple things. What kind of soup she liked, whether she preferred rainy days or sunny ones, if she'd ever seen the ocean. Small questions, gentle ones, building trust one word at a time. And then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, the girl's hands drifted back to the piano keys. She didn't play Chopin this time. She played something slower, softer, something she'd made up herself. A melody with no name, full of longing and quiet hope. The notes hung in the air like stars appearing one by one in a dark sky. The elderly woman listened, eyes closed, a small smile on her lips. When the girl finished, she said, Would you like to learn more? The girl looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Yes, she whispered, and just like that, a door opened, not with fanfare, not with cameras or headlines, just two people on a quiet evening, sharing soup and silence and the beginning of something new. In the days that followed, the girl began coming by regularly. Not every day. She still had places to sleep, things to figure out, but often enough that the cafe staff started setting aside a plate for her. The elderly woman met her there each time, bringing sheet music, a small notebook, and endless patience. She didn't push. She didn't treat the girl like a miracle or a project. She treated her like a student, like someone worthy of time, of care, of belief, and slowly the girl began to bloom. She learned to read music properly. She practiced scales with focused determination. She asked questions about composers, about history, about why certain chords made people feel certain ways. Her hunger for knowledge matched her hunger for food, and the woman fed both with equal care. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently on the cafe's awning, the girl played a piece she'd been working on for weeks. It wasn't perfect. She missed a few notes, but it was hers. And when she finished, the elderly woman placed a hand on her shoulder and said, You're not just playing the piano. You're speaking through it. The girl looked up, eyes shining. I always felt like the music was the only thing that listened. Now you have more than music, the woman said softly. You have me. Outside, the city kept moving. But inside that little cafe, something rare was growing. Not fame, not fortune, but something far more valuable. Trust. And with it, the quiet, steady return of a childhood that had almost been lost. No one knew yet how far she would go. But they all knew one thing for certain. The girl who once asked, "Can I play for a piece of food?" had already given the world something far greater than anyone had expected. Before the piano, before the cafe, before the sandwich and the stew, and silence. There was a small apartment on the third floor of a building with peeling paint and a hallway that always smelled faintly of onions and old carpet. It wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a stove that clicked when it turned on, and a window in the living room that looked out over the rooftops of the city. But to the girl, it had been everything. Her father worked nights as a cleaner in an office building downtown. He came home just before sunrise, his boots muddy, his hands rough, but his eyes always soft when he saw her. He didn't talk much, but he hummed. Always humming. Old songs, classical pieces he'd heard on the radio, melodies he made up on the spot while fixing a leaky faucet or patching a hole in the wall. Music lived in him like breath. He'd found the keyboard at a flea market for $5. It was missing 2 keys and didn't have real piano sound, just tinny electronic notes that buzzed when you held them too long. But to her, it was magic. Every evening after dinner, he'd sit her on his lap, place her small hands on the keys and guide her through simple tunes. Twinkle, Twinkle, Ode to Joy, a lullaby his own mother used to sing. He didn't know music theory. He couldn't read sheet music, but he knew feeling. And he taught her to listen, not just with her ears, but with her chest, her bones, her heart. Her mother worked days at a laundromat. She came home smelling of soap and warm cotton, her arms tired but her smile steady. She'd sit on the couch knitting or mending clothes while the girl practiced. Sometimes she'd clap. Sometimes she'd cry. "You sound like Joy," she once said, voice thick with something the girl didn't understand then but would remember forever. They weren't rich. They barely had enough sometimes. But they had each other. And they had music. Then, one rainy Tuesday in early spring, everything changed. The girl was at school when it happened. A phone call. A principal's office. A social worker with kind eyes and a quiet voice. 2 people, her whole world gone in an instant. A car accident on the highway. No warning. No goodbye. After that, the apartment felt too big and too small at the same time. Boxes appeared. Strangers came and went. She stayed with a cousin for a while, sleeping on a couch that smelled like mothballs. Then a group home where the lights went out at 8 and no one hummed lullabies. Then another foster family, then another. Some were kind. Most were just busy. They fed her, clothed her, made sure she went to school. But no one asked how she was feeling. No one noticed when she stopped talking. No one heard the silence where music used to live. She tried to hold on. She'd sit by open windows near music schools listening to students practice. She'd stand outside churches on Sunday mornings, catching fragments of hymns through half-open doors. Once she sneaked into a community center during a free piano workshop, hiding behind a curtain until the teacher left the room. Then she ran her fingers over the keys for 3 precious minutes before someone found her and shooed her out like a stray cat. But mostly, she listened. In her head, she played entire concertos. She imagined her father's hands guiding hers. She heard her mother's voice saying, "You sound like Joy." When she turned 12, the last foster home fell apart. The woman got sick. The man said they couldn't keep her anymore. "It's not personal," he told her, not meeting her eyes. "We just can't manage it," so she left. Not with a plan. Not with anger. Just with the coat on her back, the shoes on her feet, and the music in her mind. The streets weren't kind, but they were honest. You learned fast who to trust and who to avoid. You learned to sleep light, to eat fast, to disappear when needed. She stayed near libraries during the day, warm, quiet, full of books she couldn't take but could read for free. At night, she found corners under bridges, in bus shelters, once in an abandoned storage shed behind a bakery that still smelled faintly of bread. She never stole. Never begged, she just survived. And when the hunger got too sharp, when the cold bit too deep, she'd find a piano. Not to perform, not to impress, just to remember who she was before everything broke. That's how she ended up at the cafe. She hadn't planned to ask. She'd just been walking, stomach growling, fingers numb, when she heard the faint sound of a playlist drifting from the patio. She recognized the piece, badly recorded, missing all the feeling, but it was Chopin, and something in her chest pulled her forward. She didn't expect kindness. She expected laughter, maybe a shake of the head, maybe being told to move along. But when the owner said, "Go ahead," she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a tiny spark of hope. And when she played, it wasn't for them. It was for her parents, for the apartment with the humming hallway, for the broken keyboard and the lullabies and the smell of warm laundry. It was for all the nights she'd cried silently into her coat, wondering if anyone would ever hear her again. She didn't know the video would go viral. She didn't know people would call her a genius. She didn't care about any of that. All she knew was that for the first time in a long time, she hadn't been invisible. Now, sitting in the elderly woman's living room, a cozy space filled with books, plants, and an upright piano that actually worked, she was learning to trust again. The woman didn't pry. She didn't ask for her story right away. She just showed up. Every day. With sheet music. With soup in a thermos. With patience. Slowly the girl began to talk, not all at once. Just pieces, like notes in a song. "I used to play on a toy keyboard," she said one afternoon, fingers tracing the edge of the piano bench. "It only had 30 keys. But my dad said that was enough to start." The woman nodded. "Sometimes the smallest instrument holds the biggest music. He used to say music was like breathing." The girl added softly, "You don't think about it. You just do it." "Yes," the woman said. "And when you stop, it hurts." The girl looked up, surprised. "You know that?" "I've lost people too," the woman said gently. "Music was my way back." They didn't talk about the foster homes, not yet. But the girl started leaving small clues. A hesitation when someone raised their voice, a flinch at sudden movements, the way she always sat near an exit. The woman noticed. She didn't push. She just made sure the door was never locked. Made sure there was always food on the table. Made sure the girl knew she could leave any time, and that she'd always be welcome back. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled in the distance, the girl played a piece she'd never played before. It was slow, full of pauses, like someone searching for words they couldn't find. Halfway through, she stopped. Her hands dropped to her lap. "I can't finish it," she whispered. "Why not?" "Because it's about them. And I don't know how it ends." The woman was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Maybe it doesn't need an ending. Maybe it just needs to be heard." The girl looked at her, eyes glistening. "Do you think they'd be proud?" "I know they would," the woman said without hesitation. "Not because you're famous. Not because you play well. But because you kept going. Even when it was hard. Even when no one was listening. That's courage." Tears spilled over then, quiet and steady. The woman didn't hand her a tissue or tell her not to cry. She just sat beside her, a steady presence in the storm. After a while, the girl wiped her face, took a deep breath, and placed her hands back on the keys. This time she played the whole piece. And at the end, instead of silence, there was peace. Weeks passed. The girl started sleeping in the spare room. She enrolled in school again, just part-time for now. She practiced every day, not because she had to, but because it felt like coming home. The woman taught her about composers, about dynamics, about how to shape a phrase like a sentence. But more than that, she taught her that she mattered. One afternoon, a social worker came to visit, the same one from years ago. She'd seen the news. She'd tracked her down. She sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, watching the girl play a simple Bach invention with focused calm. "She's safe here," the woman said firmly. "I can see that," the social worker replied. "But the system, it's complicated. We need to make things official." The girl stopped playing. She looked at the woman, fear flickering in her eyes. The woman reached over and took her hand. "Nothing will change," she said. "Not really. You'll still have your room, your piano, your soup, and me." The social worker smiled gently. "Sometimes," she said, "the best families aren't the ones you're born into. They're the ones who choose you." And in that moment, the girl understood. She wasn't just learning to play piano again. She was learning to belong. The past hadn't disappeared. The grief was still there, tucked beneath her ribs like a stone. But now she wasn't carrying it alone, and that made all the difference. The video kept spreading. What started as a local curiosity became something bigger, shared across cities, then states, then countries. People called it the sandwich performance. Strangers sent messages to the cafe owner, The news stations, even the city hall, all asking the same thing. Who is she? Is she okay? Can we help? At first, the elderly woman tried to keep things quiet. She knew how quickly kindness could turn into noise, how easily a child's healing could be drowned out by cameras and headlines. She politely turned down every interview request. She asked the cafe owner to stop talking to reporters. She even unplugged her home phone for a week when the calls wouldn't stop. But the world wasn't ready to let go. Then came the letter. It arrived in a crisp white envelope, hand-delivered by a woman in a neat suit who waited patiently on the front step until the elderly woman opened the door. Inside was an invitation, not to a talk show or a photo shoot, but to a private charity gala hosted by a well-known music foundation. They'd seen the video, they'd listened, and they wanted the girl to play just once. No interviews, no press, just music, in a quiet hall filled with people who loved it as much as she did. The elderly woman read the letter 3 times. She watched the girl practice that evening, fingers steady, posture relaxed, eyes focused. She wasn't the same child who'd asked for food in exchange for a song. She was stronger now, calmer, still quiet but no longer afraid. Would you like to play for real people again? The woman asked gently over dinner. The girl looked up from her soup. Real people? People who come to listen. Not because of a video, not because you're a story, but because they love music. She thought about it for a long time. Then she nodded. Yes, but only if you're there. I'll be in the front row, the woman promised. The night of the gala arrived. The venue was elegant but not flashy. A historic hall with high ceilings, warm wood floors, and a grand piano that gleamed under soft lights. Backstage, the girl wore a simple dark dress the woman had bought her, her hair neatly combed, her hands resting in her lap. She wasn't nervous exactly, just aware that this wasn't the cafe patio, that this was a different kind of stage. You don't have to be perfect, the woman whispered, squeezing her shoulder. Just be you. When her name was called, she walked out slowly. The audience was smaller than she expected. Maybe 100 people, all seated quietly, no phones in sight. She sat at the piano, took a breath, and began. She didn't play Chopin this time. She played a piece she'd been working on for weeks, a composition of her own. It started softly, like footsteps in snow, then built into something hopeful, something alive. There were echoes of her father's humming, her mother's lullabies, the silence of the streets, the warmth of soup on a cold night. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. It was honest. When she finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. It rose all at once as if pulled to its feet by the same invisible thread. Tears glistened in more than a few eyes. Afterward, a man in a tailored suit approached the elderly woman. He introduced himself as the head of a prestigious music academy. We'd like to offer her a full scholarship, he said. Not just for lessons, for everything. Housing, meals, instruments, tutors. She belongs with us. The woman didn't say yes right away. She looked at the girl who stood nearby holding a glass of water, watching them with quiet curiosity. She's still a child, the woman said firmly. She needs more than music. She needs safety, stability, love. We understand, the man replied, and we're prepared to provide all of that. She'll have a mentor, a counselor, a home on campus with other young artists, but more than that, she'll have a future. They talked for nearly an hour. The woman asked hard questions. Who would check on her at night? Could she leave if she felt overwhelmed? Would she still be allowed to visit the cafe to keep her routines? The man answered everyone without hesitation. Later, walking home under streetlights, the woman asked the girl what she wanted. I want to learn, the girl said simply, but I don't want to lose you. You won't, the woman said. I'll be there every step. Even if you're at the academy, I'll come to your recitals. I'll bring soup. I'll sit in the same seat. The girl smiled, small but real. Then yes, the transition wasn't instant. There were meetings with social workers, school transfers, paperwork that seemed endless. But through it all, the woman stayed close. She helped pack the girl's few belongings, mostly books, a worn-out notebook full of scribbled melodies, and the folded paper with the cafe's address, now creased from being carried everywhere. On the first day at the academy, the girl stood at the entrance, backpack on her shoulders, eyes wide. The building was old, grand, filled with the sound of scales and arpeggios drifting from open practice rooms. Students hurried past in neat clothes, some carrying violins, others sheet music. She felt small. Then she saw the piano in the main hall, gleaming, perfect, waiting. She walked over, sat down, and played a single chord. Just to hear it. Just to know she belonged, and she did. But she never forgot where she came from. Every Sunday she returned to the cafe. Not to play for food, she had plenty now, but to sit with the owner, to share a meal with other kids she'd met on the streets, to remind them that someone sees them. She started leaving sheet music on the piano bench with simple notes. Try this. You can do it. Once she saw a boy, maybe 10 years old, standing at the edge of the patio, eyes on the piano, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked hungry, scared, familiar. She walked over. "Can I help you?" she asked softly. He looked up, startled. I just like the music," she nodded. "Want to try?" He shook his head. "I don't know how." "Neither did I," she said. "Come on." She sat beside him on the bench and showed him 3 notes. "This is how it starts," she said. He played them, clumsy but proud. She smiled. "Now you're a musician." And just like that, the circle began again, not with fame, not with fortune, but with one small act of kindness passed from one lost soul to another. Back at the academy, her talent grew, but so did her heart. She practiced harder than anyone, not for applause, but because music was her language now, and she had so much to say. Teachers noticed not just her skill, but her humility. She helped younger students. She stayed late to tune pianos. She never acted like she was special because she knew the truth. Genius isn't about perfect notes. It's about showing up, even when you're broken. It's about offering your song when all you have is hunger and hope. And she had both. The elderly woman watched from the wings. Always. She never missed a recital. She still brought soup. And every time the girl played, she saw not just a prodigy, but a child who had been given a second chance and was using it to lift others up. That was the real miracle. Not the viral video, not the scholarship, not the standing ovations. It was this. A girl who once asked, "Can I play for a piece of food?" was now making sure no one else had to ask alone. The night of the big concert arrived with a hush that felt almost sacred. Outside the Grand Symphony Hall, the city glittered under a sky dusted with stars, but inside the air was still, charged with anticipation, yet strangely calm. People in evening clothes filed in quietly, handing over coats, finding their seats, speaking in low voices as if they already sensed this wouldn't be an ordinary performance. In the front row, an elderly woman sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the empty stage. She wore a simple dress, nothing fancy, but her posture was proud. She'd been coming to this hall for decades, as a student, as a teacher, as a listener. But tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't just here for the music. She was here for the person making it. Backstage, the young woman, no longer a child but not quite yet fully grown, stood alone in the quiet. At 19, she carried herself with a grace that came not from fame, but from having walked through fire and come out the other side still willing to believe in beauty. Her dress was deep blue like twilight, and her hands, once chapped and trembling from cold, now rested steady at her sides. She wasn't nervous. Not really. The kind of fear that used to knot her stomach, the fear of being unseen, of being turned away, of not being enough, had long since faded. What she felt now was something deeper, gratitude, and purpose. She thought back to that cold autumn evening years ago, standing barefoot on cobblestones, stomach hollow, heart pounding as she asked a stranger for a chance. She remembered the laughter, the silence that followed, the warmth of soup in her hands, the weight of a folded paper tucked over her heart. She remembered sleeping in bus shelters, listening to pianos through open windows, playing melodies in her head when her fingers had nowhere to land. And she remembered the woman who saw her, not as a story, not as a miracle, but as a person worth protecting, worth teaching, worth loving. A stagehand appeared in the doorway. 5 minutes, he whispered. She nodded, took a slow breath, and walked toward the piano waiting in the center of the stage. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the audience. Then she stepped into the spotlight. No fanfare. No introduction. Just her, the piano, and the space between them. She sat, placed her hands on the keys, and began. The piece she played first was one the world already knew, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same one she'd played that night at the cafe. But now it was different. Riche. For deeper. Not because her technique had improved, though it had, but because her life had. Every note carried the weight of everything she'd survived, and the light of everything she'd been given. The audience listened, many with tears already forming, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. After that came Beethoven, then Debussy, then a modern composer few had heard of, but the real moment came at the end. She stood briefly, bowed, then returned to the piano for her final piece. This one had no famous name attached to it, no centuries of history. It was hers alone. She called it "Wow for a Sandwich." The opening notes were soft, almost hesitant, like a question. Then they grew, weaving together fragments of memory. The hum of a father fixing things late at night, the smell of laundry soap, the sound of rain on a shelter roof, the clink of a soup bowl on a cafe table, the first chord played on a broken keyboard. There was sorrow in it, yes, but also resilience, joy, hope, and above all, gratitude. When the last note faded into silence, the hall stayed still for a long moment. Then as one, the audience rose to their feet. Not just clapping, but cheering, crying, some even covering their mouths in awe. It wasn't just about the music. It was about the journey behind it. She stood, eyes glistening, and looked out at the crowd. Her gaze found the front row. The elderly woman was crying openly now, smiling through her tears, clapping with both hands. Then, instead of leaving the stage, the young woman stepped to the microphone placed at the edge of the piano. "I didn't start playing because I wanted to be famous," she began, her voice clear and calm. "I started because music was the only thing that made me feel like I still existed when the world acted like I didn't." She paused, looking down for a second, then back up. "Years ago, I stood in a city square, cold and hungry, and asked a simple question. Can I play for a piece of food?" Most people laughed, but one person said yes, and that yes changed everything. She looked directly at the woman in the front row. That yes taught me that kindness doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. That sometimes all someone needs is a sandwich, a blanket, or just someone who listens. She took a breath. "Tonight, I'm not just playing for you. I'm playing for every child who's ever been told they're too small, too broken, or too invisible to matter. And I want you to know your voice matters. Your song matters, even if no one's heard it yet." The applause swelled again, deeper this time, full of emotion. After the concert, there were no flashy parties, no interviews under bright lights, just a quiet dinner backstage with the elderly woman, the cafe owner, who'd taken the bus all the way across town to be there, and a few close friends from the academy. Over warm bread and tea, they talked about ordinary things, the weather, a new book, how the cafe's piano needed new felt on the hammers. But beneath the small talk was something unspoken. Pride. Love. Completion. A few weeks later, the young woman stood in front of a city council meeting, not as a performer, but as a founder. She'd spent months planning, meeting with social workers, musicians, and community leaders. Now she unveiled her dream, a nonprofit called Keys for All. The idea was simple. Place pianos, real playable pianos, in shelters, youth centers, and community spaces. Offer free lessons to kids who had nowhere else to go. Train volunteers, musicians, teachers, even former street kids like her, to show up, listen, and say, yes. No child should have to trade their talent for a meal, she told the room. Music isn't a luxury, it's a lifeline. The program launched that spring. The first piano was placed in the very shelter she'd once slept near. The second went to a youth center downtown. The third, donated by a local music store, was wheeled into the cafe patio, right beside the old upright that had started it all. On opening day, she sat at that new piano and played for no one in particular, just for the air, for the memory, for the kids who might walk by and wonder, could I do that too? And sure enough, a boy stopped. Then a girl. Then two more. They didn't say anything. They just listened. Later, one of them asked, "Can I try?" She moved over on the bench. "Of course," she said. Everyone starts with one note. Years from now, people might remember her as the girl who played Chopin for a sandwich. But she hoped they'd remember something else, that genius isn't born in concert halls. It's born in hunger, in hope, in the courage to ask for a chance. And that sometimes, the smallest act of kindness, a sandwich, a blanket, a single yes, can echo louder than any symphony. Back at the symphony hall, Long after the last guest had left, the elderly woman lingered in her seat. She looked at the empty stage, then at the program in her hands. On the back, in neat handwriting, the young woman had written, "Thank you for hearing me when no one else did." She folded the program carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket, right over her heart. Outside, the city hummed on. But somewhere, in a shelter, in a cafe, in a quiet room with a piano and a child who dared to ask, a new song was just beginning.